I came home from my mother-in-law's hospital room on a Tuesday afternoon to find my sister-in-law sitting at my kitchen table, eating my food and laughing on the phone like she owned the place. She had a key because I gave her one 3 months ago when my mother-in-law's health started declining, and we all agreed to take turns checking on the house. I stood in the doorway for a second before she noticed me, and I heard her say into the phone, "She has no idea. She thinks we're being supportive." Then she looked up, and her whole face rearranged itself into something warm and concerned. "Oh, I have to go," she told whoever she was talking to. She just got back. I smiled at her. I put my bag down. I asked if there was any news about the estate paperwork, because my mother-in-law had been asking about it at the hospital that morning, confused and scared and grabbing my hand tighter than I expected for a woman who'd spent 3 years making my life difficult. My sister-in-law told me not to worry about it, that our brother was handling everything, that I should focus on being a supportive wife and leave the financial stuff to the people who understood it. I am a certified fraud examiner. I have spent 6 years auditing financial misconduct for a mid-sized private firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I understand financial stuff just fine. But I smiled again and said, "Of course." And the second she left, I sat down at that kitchen table and I started thinking very carefully about what she might have meant. My name is Felicia. I am 31 years old. My husband and I had been married for 4 years when his mother, who I will call my mother-in-law because I have no desire to humanize her with a name right now, had a severe stroke that left her partially paralyzed and requiring round-the-clock care. Before the stroke, she had spent the better part of our marriage making it abundantly clear that she thought her son had married down. I was not from money. My family was solidly working class from a small town in South Carolina. She wanted someone with connections, with a family name that meant something at the country club she attended every Thursday. My husband, to his credit, had always defended me. He told her I was brilliant, that I had built my career from nothing, that she should respect that. She would nod and then find another way to make me feel like a guest in her son's life. When she had her stroke, everything shifted. She had 2 children, my husband and his sister, and a substantial estate, a house in a wealthy suburb of Charlotte worth somewhere around $1.4 million. Investment accounts, a vacation property in the mountains. My father-in-law had died 8 years earlier, and she had managed everything herself since then with the help of a longtime financial advisor named Mr. Punink Whitfield, who was in his late 70s and, from what I could tell, had been doing her family a favor for decades without asking too many questions. The problem was that my mother-in-law had not updated her estate documents in a long time. She did not have a clear power of attorney in place. She did not have a healthcare proxy that was current. In the weeks after the stroke, while she was still in intensive care, my husband and his sister began talking about what needed to happen. Those conversations, which I was not invited to, apparently resulted in a plan. I found out about the plan in pieces. The first piece was the key my sister-in-law used to let herself into our home. I gave her that key for emergencies. She started using it regularly, often when I was at the hospital and my husband was at work. I came home twice to find things slightly moved. A drawer in my home office that I kept locked was, one afternoon, visibly tampered with. The lock still worked, but the scratch marks around the keyhole were new. The second piece was a conversation I overheard at the hospital. My mother-in-law had a semi-private room and I had stepped out to get coffee from the machine down the hall. When I came back, I slowed down before reaching the door because I could hear my sister-in-law's voice in a tone I had not heard before. Low and fast. She was telling my mother-in-law that the documents were ready, that the attorney had drawn everything up, that my mother-in-law just needed to sign and then everything would be protected. "You don't want Felicia controlling your assets if something happens to him," she said. I heard my mother-in-law make a sound, something between agreement and uncertainty, and then my sister-in-law said, "She'll drain it. Women like her always do. She came from nothing, and she's been waiting for this." I stood in that hallway with a paper cup of bad hospital coffee, and I felt the specific cold clarity that I now recognize as the moment I stopped being a family member and became an investigator. I walked back into the room. I said nothing about what I had heard. I sat down next to my mother-in-law's bed and held her hand, and I talked to her about small things, about the weather, about the bird feeder in her backyard that had been empty for 2 weeks and that I would refill when I got a chance, That night I told my husband I was worried about the estate documents and asked if he'd had a chance to review what his sister and Mr. Whitfield had been preparing. He looked at me with something I can only describe as carefully constructed vagueness and told me his sister had it handled. I asked if I could see the draft documents. He said they weren't finalized yet. I asked who the attorney was. He said he didn't remember the name offhand. My husband, who I had loved and trusted for 7 years, could not remember the name of the attorney handling his mother's estate. I am trained to notice when numbers don't add up. I am also trained to notice when people do. The next morning, I called the county courthouse and requested a search of any recent filings related to my mother-in-law's name or address. It took 3 days to get the results back. What I found was a limited power of attorney that had been filed 11 days earlier. It named my sister-in-law as the sole agent with authority over all financial accounts, real property, and investment assets. It was signed by my mother-in-law. The signature looked right, but something about it made me stop. I had seen my mother-in-law's signature on dozens of documents over 4 years. Birthday cards, a lease agreement for the mountain property, a letter she wrote to our homeowners association about a landscaping dispute. This signature was correct in shape but wrong in pressure. It looked like someone signing a name they had practiced, not a name they had written 10,000 times. I made a copy. I took it to a certified document examiner I had worked with twice before on fraud cases. His name is not important, but his report became important later. He told me the signature showed significant inconsistency in pen pressure and tremor patterns inconsistent with voluntary signing. In plain language, someone had either guided my mother-in-law's hand, or she had signed under conditions of severe duress or impairment. The stroke had affected my mother-in-law's left side. She was right-handed. She could technically hold a pen, but her cognition in those first 2 weeks had been, according to her neurologist's notes, significantly compromised. She had been scoring low on orientation tests. She sometimes didn't know what day it was. The medical team had been careful to document this because they were concerned about exactly this kind of situation. I sat with all of this information for 48 hours before I decided what to do with it. I did not confront my husband. I did not call my sister-in-law. I did not walk into the hospital room and announce what I knew. I had spent 6 years watching people blow up fraud cases by moving too fast, by tipping off the people they were investigating before the evidence was airtight. I was not going to do that. Instead, I did 3 things. First, I called an elder law attorney in Charlotte named Ms. Carver. She was a woman in her late 50s who had been recommended to me by a colleague, and she specialized in exactly this kind of situation: exploitation of elderly and incapacitated adults. I laid out everything I had and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You've done most of my job already." She agreed to take the case. Second, I contacted my mother-in-law's neurologist directly and requested that the medical team flag any further document signings and require a formal capacity evaluation before proceeding. The neurologist, to her credit, had already been thinking about this. She told me she would put a note in the chart that any legal documents presented to the patient required attending physician review. She also told me, gently, that what I was describing sounded like financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, which was a reportable offense in North Carolina. Third, I started quietly making an inventory. I requested account statements from Mr. Whitfield, framing it as wanting to help my husband understand his mother's financial picture during this difficult time. Mr. Whitfield, who was elderly and tired, and I think genuinely did not realize what had been happening around him, sent me a summary. 2 of my mother-in-law's accounts had seen significant transfers in the previous 6 weeks. A total of $240,000 had moved, in several transactions just below the federal reporting threshold, from her primary investment account into an LLC I had never heard of. The LLC had been registered in Delaware 18 months earlier. The registered agent was a company that specialized in anonymous shell structures. The managing member, after 3 hours of careful cross-referencing through public records, was my sister-in-law's husband. My sister-in-law's husband, who presented himself at every family gathering as a successful commercial contractor, who drove a truck with his company logo on the side, who shook hands firmly and talked about projects he was managing. He was also, I now discovered, 2 years behind on his business taxes and the subject of 2 civil judgments from subcontractors he had never paid. I added everything to a secure encrypted folder on a device I kept at my office, not at home. I had started to understand that my home was not entirely private anymore. The moment that changed the temperature of everything happened on a Wednesday night about 3 weeks after I first found those court filings. I came home to a house that felt immediately wrong. Not obviously disturbed, just slightly off in the way that a room feels when someone has been in it carefully. I checked my home office first. The locked drawer I had been monitoring looked untouched, but I had placed a small piece of clear tape across the frame at a specific angle. The tape had been broken and replaced, not perfectly. Someone had opened that drawer and tried to put things back exactly as they found them. They were close. Not close enough. I had moved the actual documents 2 weeks before. The drawer held nothing important. But they didn't know that, which told me something useful about what they were looking for and how worried they had become. I installed 3 additional cameras in the house that weekend. Small ones. One in the living room, one in my home office aimed at the desk and the door, one in the entryway. I connected them to a private cloud server, not the one linked to our shared home account. I changed the lock on my office door to a model that required a numeric code. I told my husband it was because I had client-sensitive materials from work, and my firm had recently updated their security protocols. He said that made sense. He didn't ask follow-up questions. I noticed he didn't ask follow-up questions a lot lately. 3 days after the cameras went in, my sister-in-law came by while I was at work. I watched the footage that evening. She let herself in with the key, walked directly to my office, tried the handle, stood there for about 40 seconds, and then took out her phone and made a call. I could not hear the conversation, but I watched her face. She was not worried. She was annoyed. There is a difference, and the difference told me she had not found what she came looking for yet, but she thought she still had time. I went to see Ms. Carver the next morning. I showed her the footage. She pulled up something on her screen and turned it toward me. I filed an emergency petition yesterday to have the power of attorney reviewed and temporarily suspended pending a capacity evaluation, she said. We have a hearing date in 3 weeks. She also told me that in cases like this, one of the most effective things we could do was let the other side believe they still had the advantage until the moment they didn't. I understood that instruction completely. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in family court. 3 days before it, my sister-in-law called me. She sounded warm and concerned, the version of herself she deployed when she wanted something. She said she thought we should talk before things got more complicated. She suggested coffee. I said yes. We met at a place near her house. She was dressed carefully, which I noted, and she arrived with a folder, which I also noted. She sat down and ordered a latte and told me she was worried about me. That she could tell I was struggling with the stress of my mother-in-law's illness. That grief and fear sometimes made people see problems where none existed. She told me that the power of attorney had been done properly, with a legitimate attorney, and that my mother-in-law had been completely clear-eyed when she signed it. She told me that pursuing this was going to fracture the family permanently. And did I really want to do that to my husband? She slid the folder across the table. Inside was a letter, unsigned, from someone claiming to be a colleague of mine who was apparently willing to state that I had shown signs of mental and emotional instability at work over the past year. She told me she didn't want to use it, but that if I kept pushing this, she would have no choice but to present it to the court as evidence that I was acting out of personal grievance rather than genuine concern. I looked at that letter for a long moment. Then I looked up at her and said, "That's forged. My firm doesn't have anyone by that name on staff, and I'd be happy to verify that under oath." Her smile didn't fully disappear, but it shifted. Something tightened around her eyes. I told her I appreciated her reaching out and that I hoped to see her at the hearing. I left the coffee shop before she could respond. I drove directly to Miss Carver's office and delivered the folder. By the time I got back to my car, I was shaking, which I had not let myself do at the table, but shaking in a parking lot was fine. What mattered was what I had not done at that table, which was show her how much I actually knew. The morning of the hearing, I dressed in the way I dress when I testify at fraud proceedings. Charcoal blazer. Simple jewelry, nothing that reads as either aggressive or deferential. I arrived early and sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Ms. Carver, reviewing the documents one final time. My sister-in-law arrived with her husband and their attorney, a man who had a loud voice and a habit of interrupting. They did not speak to me. My husband arrived separately, which I had not expected, and he sat in the middle of the hallway between the two groups, not meeting anyone's eyes, including mine. Inside the courtroom, the judge was a direct woman in her early 60s who I later learned had spent 12 years as a public defender before going on the bench. She did not look like someone who had patience for theater. My sister-in-law's attorney opened by characterizing my petition as the act of a woman attempting to insert herself into a family matter she had no legal standing in, motivated by financial self-interest and personal animosity toward her mother-in-law. He made a show of the warm relationship between my sister-in-law and my mother-in-law. He presented photographs, he presented cards, he presented a statement from Mr. Whitfield saying that to his knowledge, the power of attorney had been executed properly. Then Ms. Carver stood up. She submitted the document examiner's report first. The judge read it without expression and then asked my sister-in-law's attorney if his client had a response. He said the signature had been reviewed by their own expert. Ms. Carver asked for the name and credentials of that expert. There was a pause. The attorney said it was being prepared. The judge wrote something down. Ms. Carver submitted the medical records next, specifically the neurologist's documented assessments of my mother-in-law's cognitive state in the 2 weeks before and after the signing date. The records showed that on the day the document was signed, my mother-in-law had scored a 14 out of 30 on a standard orientation assessment. The threshold for presumed legal capacity is generally considered to be 24 or above. 14. My sister-in-law's husband, sitting in the gallery, audibly exhaled. Then Ms. Carver submitted the account statements showing the $240,000 in transfers. She submitted the Delaware LLC registration. She submitted the public records connecting the LLC to my sister-in-law's husband. She did this quietly and in order, the way you lay down cards when you already know you've won. The judge looked at the transfers. She looked at the transfers. She looked at the LLC. She looked at my sister-in-law's husband across the gallery. "Sir," she said, "are you represented by counsel today?" He said yes, his wife's attorney. The judge suggested very calmly that he might want to retain his own. The power of attorney was suspended that day, pending a full capacity investigation and forensic accounting review of all transfers made in the previous 90 days. The judge also ordered an emergency appointment of a professional guardian to manage my mother-in-law's assets and medical decisions until the matter was resolved. My sister-in-law was explicitly barred from accessing any accounts in my mother-in-law's name. My sister-in-law cried in the hallway outside the courtroom. Not the soft, genuine kind. The loud, theatrical kind designed to be witnessed. Her husband stood next to her with his hands in his pockets looking at the floor. Their attorney was already on his phone and he did not look like he was scheduling a celebration dinner. My husband found me in the hallway. He had not spoken during the hearing. He stood in front of me for a moment and then said, quietly, that he didn't know about the transfers. I looked at him, and I said I believed him, because I actually did. What I had come to understand over those weeks was that my husband had not been scheming against me. He had been doing something in some ways harder to forgive, which was choosing not to look at things too closely because looking would have required him to act. We had a long, difficult conversation that night, and then another one, and then several more over the following weeks. I won't pretend that the marriage came out of this without damage, because it didn't. Trust, once you've had real reason to question it, doesn't just reset when the facts are clarified. We are still working on that. I think we might keep working on it for a long time, but that part is private and still unresolved, and some things don't have a clean ending the way fraud cases do. The forensic accounting review concluded 4 months later. The transfers were classified as financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, which, under North Carolina law, is a felony. My sister-in-law's husband was charged. He accepted a plea deal that included full restitution, substantial fines, and 3 years of supervised probation. His contracting business, which had already been struggling, did not survive the publicity. My sister-in-law was not charged, but the civil liability case brought by the professional guardian on behalf of my mother-in-law's estate named her as a knowing participant. She settled. I don't know the terms because I was not party to that settlement, but I do know that the vacation property in the mountains, which she had apparently been planning to inherit in an amended will that had not yet been finalized, was not part of any deal she walked away with. Mr. Whitfield retired shortly after. I think he felt genuinely terrible, and I think he should. And I also think he was an old man who was tired and trusted the wrong people, and that is a specific kind of tragedy that doesn't require my anger. My mother-in-law spent 6 months in a rehabilitation facility and then transitioned to a memory care community. Her cognition continued to decline. Some days she knows who I am, and some days she doesn't. On the days she does, she holds my hand the same way she did in the hospital that first week after the stroke, tight and a little scared, and I bring her the same kind of coffee she always liked, sweet and with too much cream, and I sit with her for an hour, and I don't think about what her daughter tried to do. I just think about the fact that somebody should be sitting with her, and today, that somebody is me. I did not want any of this. I did not want to find out that people I shared holidays with were capable of this. I did not want to spend months collecting evidence in secret, installing cameras in my own house, watching footage of someone I was supposed to trust using a key I gave her in good faith. I did not want to sit across from a woman at a coffee shop and feel my hands steady themselves under a table while she tried to threaten me with a forged letter. But here is what I know now, that I did not know 4 years ago when I got married and became part of a family I thought I was lucky to be joining. The skills you build in your professional life, the ones that feel cold and technical and removed from ordinary human feeling. Sometimes those skills are exactly what stands between you and losing everything, not because the work is glamorous or satisfying in the revenge fantasy way people sometimes imagine, but because someone has to be paying attention. Someone has to be the person who notices that the tape across the drawer frame was broken and replaced. I was paying attention, and I am still here. If you've ever had to be the person in your own family who quietly held the line when everyone around you was hoping you wouldn't, I want you to know that I see that. It is exhausting and lonely, and it doesn't come with applause. Subscribe to Recovery Stories if this reached you, and leave a comment below, because sometimes just knowing someone else has been in that hallway outside the courtroom, shaking in a parking lot, making the quiet choice to keep going. That's the thing that makes the difference. I have thought a lot about why things unfolded the way they did. Not in a mystical way, not searching for some cosmic explanation, but in the plain, observable way that I think about most things. Actions produce consequences, not always immediately, not always visibly, but consistently, over time, if you pay attention. My sister-in-law and her husband made a series of choices. They chose to take money from a woman who was lying in a hospital bed unable to fully understand what was happening around her. They chose to use forged documents and manufactured pressure and a key given in good faith to keep that plan running, and at every step, they chose to underestimate me. That last choice was the one that cost them everything, because the other choices might have held if they had been smarter about who was watching. What I keep coming back to is this. They were not unintelligent people. They knew enough to structure the transfers below reporting thresholds. They knew enough to use a Delaware LLC. They knew enough to try to replace the tape on my drawer frame. The problem was not a lack of cleverness. The problem was that their cleverness was entirely in service of taking something, not building something. When your whole strategy depends on another person staying confused and passive, you've already handed that person the advantage, because the moment they stop being confused and passive, you have nothing left. I think about the version of myself that might have walked away from this. The version that told herself it was too complicated, too painful, that confronting it would blow up her marriage and her family relationships and maybe even her career if it went badly. That version existed. I felt her pulling at me for weeks, that exhausted, conflict-avoidant part of me that just wanted to take care of my mother-in-law and go home and not have this be my problem. I understand why people make that choice. I really do. The cost of paying attention is not small, but I also know what it costs to look away. I know because I watched Mr. Whitfield look away, slowly and with the best intentions, for years. He was not a bad man. He was a tired man who trusted the people in front of him more than the numbers on the page, and that quieter, more comfortable choice resulted in $240,000, leaving the accounts of a woman who needed that money for her care. What I want to say to anyone watching this who is in the middle of something similar, who feels the pull between keeping the peace and keeping their eyes open, is that paying attention is not aggression. Asking questions is not disloyalty. Being the person who notices things is not the same as being the person who causes problems. My sister-in-law wanted me to believe those things were the same because as long as I believed that, she was safe. The moment I separated them, she wasn't. Intelligence without ethics is just a more sophisticated way to cause harm. I watched that play out in real time. My sister-in-law's husband was smart enough to build a shell structure across state lines. He was not wise enough to understand that the person he was stealing from had a wife who did this for a living. Cleverness in the service of something wrong tends to collapse under its own weight eventually, because it requires the world to keep cooperating with the lie, and the world does not always do that. What held me together through all of it was not confidence. Most days I was not confident. What held me together was just the decision, remade every morning, to keep going. To make one more call. To review one more document. To not let one more day pass where I knew something was wrong and did nothing about it. That's the only thing I know how to tell you. Not that it will be clean or fast or that it won't cost you anything. But that staying present, staying honest, and refusing to stop looking. That is how you get to the other side.